Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the KOOF PLC investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged. They can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab that's just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please just simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all of the questions submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I would like to submit the following poll, and if you could give that your kind attention, I'm sure that would be most appreciated by the company. And I'd now like to hand you over to CEO Tim Barker. Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for that introduction, Jake. Hi, everyone. A real pleasure for us to walk you through an introduction into KOOF. And today we've announced our trading update so we can give you a fresh insight into the world of health tech. So perhaps let's just start by framing the problem that we're focused on, a $6 trillion global crisis in mental health, one of the biggest challenges of our time. In fact, there are not enough therapists on the planet to deal with the level of demand that there now is. And so in order to tackle this, we need a transformation in how digital can support every individual's mental health. Traditionally, the healthcare system is focused on treatment. You are prescribed support after being diagnosed with a condition. You sit on a waiting list. You go to a place to get support. In order to tackle the magnitude of this challenge, we need to stop people needing that level of support. And the answer to that is to provide early intervention and rapid intervention to support individuals at that first moment when things start to go wrong. And to tackle that in a very person-centric way, to make it open access so there's no barriers to getting support, to provide you with support rapidly that is efficient and effective. And the benefit of digital is you can make this universally accessible across a population. And that's what we do. KOOF is a pioneer in digital mental health care. We were founded in 2001 in Greater Manchester. And from those early days, we've grown and helped transform digital mental health care in the UK. We're now over 400 employees, with a service that is accessible to over 15 million people across the country. Our biggest customer is the NHS. And in providing that, as you can see on the map on the left, our service is on the path to becoming a universally accessible service across the country. Where we got started is to supporting children and young people, CYPs, as they're known in our industry, 10 to 25-year-olds. And one key reason for that is if you want to help tackle this crisis, you need to start supporting people at their young age, when 75% of all mental health issues are formed. We're the only service accredited by the industry body for counselling and psychotherapy, the BACP, across the UK, and we've got an abundance of research papers and evidence that proves the efficacy of our service. How it works is we provide an open access service. That means you do not need to go to a GP or get a referral from a healthcare service. There's no barrier to access. You can sign up. When signing up, it's both a confidential service and, when you start using the service, an anonymous one, because there is a stigma about asking for help, which we help address. We give people choice, so they're empowered. They're not prescribed. They can choose what kind of support is beneficial for them. So they can get support through the content and activities we provide. It's known as self-therapy. They can access a thriving community where they can get help from others that have been in similar position to themselves. And with one click, they can access professional support through our platform, all delivered as a live chat service, similar to DMing someone on WhatsApp. So that means it's really convenient, confidential. We do this in a very safe way. So every piece of content that people post is reviewed by our moderation team to ensure that it's appropriate and safe. And we integrate with healthcare systems. We're not a digital island. We refer people on or into KOOF from other services as needed. Early intervention, by the way, doesn't just mean people that are dealing with very mild issues. More than 80% of individuals that come to KOOF would be marked by an assessment as a moderate or severe level of acuity, and over half of the people that we see are struggling with suicidal thoughts or self-harm. So we are seeing and holding people that otherwise may be sitting on those waiting lists, going into A&E, getting acute support from the NHS. So by supporting them online, holding them and helping them in our service, we also have a great story around health economics. Every pound spent on COOF in the UK saves the healthcare system £3.14. And in doing so, one of the incredible things about our service is when you open it up for all, you can observe and see what kind of support people want. The traditional offer of mental health support is what's called structured and ongoing therapy, where you might see a counsellor every week for the next 6 to 12 weeks. Yet only 5% of our users opt or need that level of support. 95% get the support through the community, the content, or messaging our practitioners, or doing drop-in chats, single session therapy, as we call it. And as part of that, we've developed over many years therapeutic outcomes that really demonstrate the impact of what we do. In effect, 70% or more of people that engage with our platform show an improvement.
Great, thanks, Tim. So just briefly taking a look at our business model. As Tim mentioned earlier on, our service is completely free at the point of use for the end user, be it a young person or an adult. But we will typically contract with a region or a corporate, initially on a 12-month contract. It's very much a pilot project. With over 25 million data points within COOF, we can, at the outset, quite accurately model what we think use of the service will be in that first 12-month period, and that allows us to negotiate and agree a fee with the client. Our first year fee is typically in the region of £125,000 to £150,000. And that'll be based on, the age range we'll be covering, the demographic, whether it's an urban area versus a rural area, perhaps looking at, the usage amongst ethnic minorities in that particular area. So our intention then is to mobilize the contract. At the start of the contract, we have our engagement staff who are essentially our feet on the ground across the country, and they will go into schools, doctor surgeries, youth clubs, etc., to promote the service predominantly to young people, encouraging them to to register for the service. And we'll also supplement that with some specifically targeted social media campaigns. And the intention is very much to increase usage of the service. So, perhaps 1 in 30 across that particular region will be using the service to start with. And as I said, the intention is to get more and more people using the service, perhaps also through word of mouth. And that enables us at the end of the pilot period to have a fresh discussion with the client, given the additional usage. We may also add a new age group. So we might be looking after the 10 to 18-year-old age group initially, and we might add the 19 to 25-year-old age group to that as well. Those factors allow us to expand the contract and to potentially get an uplift in the fee value of the contract after the initial pilot period is over. And around 50 to 60% of our contracts expand at the time of renewal. A good example of that is the next slide, Tim, if you just flip it over. This was a client, one particular CCG within the NHS that we initially contracted with back in 2004. And over the last 5 or 6 years, that we've seen some quite dramatic growth in the value of that contract as other CCGs, regions, surrounding regions then came into the fold. We went from the 10 to 18-year-old age group. We added 19 to 25-year-olds. And last year, early last year, we were able to add adults across that region as well. So we're looking after more than 2 million people in that particular region. And as you can see, our revenue growth has averaged around 32% over the last 5 or 6 years.
So looking at the growth pillars that we have, given the huge amount of demand that there is for mental health support, we really focus our efforts in 4 areas. Where we got started, supporting children and young people, that's up to age 25, primarily selling through to the NHS, which in itself is an £85 million a year market for us to really scale up and support the level of need that we see. Then also supporting adults, so providing that support for the older age groups. So again, early intervention support. We've got a business unit focused on selling into the workforce, which we'll talk more about, which we estimate is 150 million a year business in the UK alone. And internationally, with our main focus right now on being expansion into the US. And again, we'll add some more color to that in a second. So talking about the US, to give you a bit of market context, look, in the last year, there's been a huge shift in the recognition that there is a youth mental health crisis. It started with the US Surgeon General issuing an urgent call for action in December 2021. It featured as one of the headlines in Biden's first State of the Union. And then by summer last year, we started to see both at a federal level and a state level increased funding into mental health care. In total, last year, at least $6 billion has been allocated to tackle the youth mental health crisis. And of course, Kooth's got an incredible story and calling card there. We've got 2 decades of operation experience, a huge amount of evidence and scale that we already operate at. And so that calling card has really been a great door opener into states that are investing in tackling the youth mental health crisis. In October, we signed a contract with the state of Pennsylvania for a 1-year pilot to roll out Kooth to a pilot population of up to 150,000 school students in 30 school districts, with the objectives being to improve access to mental health support and, by focusing on early intervention, reduce the need for that more acute treatment, downstream care as we call it. We are optimistic about being successful on this pilot, and in doing so, there is clearly an opportunity to expand further within Pennsylvania, plus build a blueprint for other states so that they can apply this in their locality.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So as Tim mentioned, we issued a trading update this morning. We also have the H1 numbers here, which are probably a little bit stale, given that we've gone past the year end, and we'll be announcing full year results at the end of March and early April. But perhaps some of the highlights, our gross margins are in the region of 65 to 70%, and direct costs are predominantly the costs of our counsellors. We employ directly all of our counsellors. We're not running any sort of 0 hours contracts or contractor type arrangements. That means that we can be responsible for their training, audit, safeguarding procedures, and excuse me. And that's given us, as I say, a gross margin of around 65 to 70%, which we think is pretty much industry leading. Revenue is, we've always been very focused on the quality of our revenue. Around 95% of our revenue is recurring. That's from contracts of 12 months or longer. We announced this morning that we expect revenue to be within market expectations. That range, as you can see there, is 19.6 million to 20.2 million. Cash on the balance sheet at the end of the year was 8.5 million, and that cash is sufficient to give us a runway for our growth plans, long-term investment within the business, to get the business through to sort of break even from a cash flow perspective, given our investments, as well as from a profitability perspective.
So just to touch on the other growth pillars and services that we provide. About 3 years ago, we expanded our service from children and young people to adults. Again, really providing a missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle. Individuals that need support but are not at a sufficient level of need where they would qualify for NHS services such as talking therapies. And it's estimated that there's 8 million people across the country that would benefit from additional support but are unable to get it. So today, our service is accessible to more than 7 million people across the UK as adults. And in 2022, we rolled out 8 new, what we call whole population contracts, where we're supporting a whole region. So from Devon through to Greater Manchester, Norfolk and Warwickshire. How people hear about Kooth is quite different, or Quell, as we call it in this context. Many they may find us online, or be recommended to us through a GP, for example, a healthcare professional. And this is really our priority focus, to continue to expand in regions, building often on the success that we've had in supporting people up to age 25. And a big part of the NHS's focus and priority, as it has recently reorganised into what's known as ICSs, Integrated Care Systems, is they have a responsibility and a focus on population health. And that means providing support to those that might be underserved, ethnic minority groups, for example, LGBT groups maybe are less likely to use established services. So a real focus on making sure that we can reach those seldom heard groups, provide support across a whole population. Added to that, we continue to grow our core service to support children and young people. Our service is accessible to more than 60% of the UK's 10 to 25-year-olds, and we will be providing an update in our annual report, no doubt, on colouring this map in with a few more areas where we're available. But in some areas, our usage is now as high as 1 in 7 of the population, on average around 1 in 33 of the population. Think of it as one child in every classroom using our service. To support this, our own commercial team last year reorganised to really support the reorganised NHS, which moved from 135 clinical commissioning groups to 42 ICSs, meaning that we can support larger regions through our current team. Finally, we have a team focused on selling into workforces and supporting employees. Now, the corporate market for mental health is quite fragmented. Everything from meditation apps through to medical insurance are available. And so the niche that we're focusing on are the folks that we cheered and clapped for during COVID, frontline workers and key workers. They represent a third of the entire UK workforce, and they often work in stressed roles on the front line. We also support charities that support those workers as well. And so we have got a team focused on selling into these regions. We're focusing on ambulance services, for example, at the moment, and emergency services. And our offer to them is really in 3 parts. Firstly, we can benchmark the mental health of their company and provide them with some practical recommendations from our team of clinical psychologists of actions they could take to improve their workforce wellbeing. Secondly, we can provide proactive access and support to every employee for an issue, no matter how small or large, without barriers and confidentially as well, which is very important. And finally, we can provide back to the organisation anonymous insights so they can understand the trends that there are within the workforce, the issues that there may be, so they can improve their strategy for employee wellbeing. In terms of where we're going, our vision for the future, a key reason why we IPO'd was to give us fuel in the tank to enable us to really build over the next few years our technology vision, is to deliver personalised mental health support at scale to the population. In order to do that, we've got an incredible data set, one of the world's largest mental health data sets, where we can then, from that, identify what types of support might be beneficial to you based on how it has helped people similar to yourself. So, to some degree, taking inspiration from Netflix, that to have a highly personalized experience that's both engaging and also effective. And to get there, and in getting there, we really want to make an impact in 3 key areas. Firstly, scaling the service. So we're already a trusted partner with the NHS for over many years, and a service that has a growing footprint in the UK and now in the US. Outcomes, both therapeutic and economic outcomes, are key in providing this scale effectively. And finally, economics, to do this at an increasing economic advantage. So improving health economics, improving and reducing the cost of care by using things like AI to match people to the kind of content or support that might be beneficial to them. We will, however, of course, always be a human-powered service as well. The support that our practitioners give, the act of counselling is a very human therapeutic one, and one that we think by us building a service where technology and people work together to support people's mental health is really a critical and compelling combination that we can use to support the nation and scale up internationally. With that, that concludes the presentation. We're just going to pause. I'm going to hand this back, and we're going to then go through any questions that you may have for us.
Tim, that's great. And Sanjay as well, thank you very much indeed for your presentation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab that's situated on the top right-hand corner of your screen. But just while the team take a few moments to review those questions that were submitted already, I would like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Sanjay, Tim, we did receive a number of pre-submitted questions ahead of today's event, and as you can see there in the Q&A tab, we have also received a number of questions throughout your presentation this afternoon as well. So firstly, thank you to all of those on the call for taking the time to submit their questions. And Tim, Sanjay, if I could just hand back to you to make your way through there and just respond to those where it's appropriate to do so, and then I'll pick up from you at the end. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that. So let's start with a question from Sam. Can you expand on the scale of the opportunity for the company in the US and how you look to achieve a significant footprint here? So maybe a few key points here. Firstly, our focus in the US is exclusively on youth mental health crisis. And this is an area that's been underinvested in from a health tech perspective in the US. Most of the startups and organizations there are focused on adult mental health. It also is the key area where we've got world-leading expertise. Our focus there is primarily right now focused on the opportunity in hand, which is to provide our service selling into state-level government to support an entire population. The interesting thing is that slide that I showed about the shift and the timeline in the last year, for mental health, given the scale of the crisis, their go-to-market model looks exactly like the NHS, a free at the point of use service. And so we are focused on statewide sales, and we are supplementing that with a focus to then sell into education. So we're also doing a pilot in a university. And so we feel that there are two ends where we can have a transactional approach to selling to universities and a transformational one to support statewide initiatives. How we achieve that, Pennsylvania is our blueprint for that. And so one regulatory difference in the US is counsellors have to be licensed in the state that they operate. And so this is ideal for us. Doing a state-by-state model means that we can build a counselling team within that state to support a contract, to support its residents. So that'll be our focus. We are and have been building a pipeline. We've been in the US around 15, 16 months. We're really delighted with the progress that we're making so far. I'm going to hand one over to you, Sanjay, which is this morning you announced 8.5 million of cash on the balance sheet. How many of your plans are supported by this figure?
Yeah, it's a good question. But one thing I've just cautioned is that cash number is probably a little bit higher than expectations. One of the great things working with Pennsylvania is that they paid the fee in full up front. So we have a bit of deferred income on the balance sheet. But we have been averaging investment in the platform over the last 2 or 3 years of around £2 to £3 million a year. At the operating cash flow level, we are pretty much break even, if not a little bit positive. So certainly we have at least 2 years of runway left at those levels. I suppose for us, one of the most exciting opportunities for us is the US, as we've sort of probably alluded to throughout the presentation. Winning Pennsylvania has put us on the map in terms of other states across the US. There's some pretty significant opportunities out there. the question for us really is, do we go full strength, full speed ahead and tackle all of those opportunities, or are we a bit more sequential about it? We demonstrate our efficacy in Pennsylvania first, we expand that contract, move to the next state. The former would probably accelerate the investment required, but of course, we believe that would lead to greater revenues. But the short answer is we are confident that we have sufficient runway here to get this business through to cash flow, break even, and profitability. I think that has actually come up in one of the other questions, and our expectation is that on a run rate basis, that within 12 months or so, we would expect to achieve both of those.
Great, thanks, Sanjay. Question from Vishal, a clarification really. In the presentation, it talks about a 12-to-1 cost-saving benefit, and I also talk about £3.14 to 1. So that's a really good observation. The difference is that £3.14 is UK healthcare system. 12-to-1 is based off of taking the same model and applying that to the US. Given the high cost of healthcare there, there is a order of magnitude, potentially larger ROI, financial ROI from deploying Kooth.
Yeah, probably worth pointing out, Tim, that counsellors are around 2 to 3 times more expensive in the US than that we would see in the UK.
Yeah, good point. Question on what differences have you noticed with reaching decision makers and in contract terms when dealing with integrated care systems rather than clinical commissioning groups? Perhaps I'll just add a bit of context, which is the NHS in June finalised a reorganisation from from a clinical commissioning group model to ICS. I think it's fair to say that any kind of large reorganisation, and there's fewer organisations larger than the NHS, slows down decision making. People identify who new decision makers are, what roles need to be filled, and in some cases, senior roles in integrated care boards are still vacant. So it's hard perhaps sometimes to progress when you don't have a finance director in place. So I think what we did see is while the deck chairs were being shuffled, no one really wanted to hold the pen on making any big decisions. And so some things, sales cycles for us certainly got delayed, but not cancelled, right? So I think we expect with the new NHS year, which commences April 1, and strategic guidance from an operational guidance from NHS England, really with a increased focus on mental health care, we feel that that's a good stabilizer to get to future planning and future growth. Perhaps a question from Sam: how fragmented is the market, and would you consider acquisitions as part of your strategy? Sanjay, would you like to talk to that?
Yeah, good question. And look, at the time we IPO'd in September 20, this question came up a number of times. We are not an acquisitive business. Both Tim and I in our background have looked after a number of acquisitions, but that's not what we've been looking to achieve at Kooth. And we certainly wouldn't be betting the house on any acquisitions. But we are starting to see, being a public company, we get approached quite a lot. And we are now starting to see some interesting things surface up, which are essentially perhaps VC-funded startups a couple of years back, where the VC may have put, 5 tens of millions of dollars into a startup, and they've perhaps lost their way a bit. The funding has dried up, and those are sort of more slightly distressed type situations. So 2 or 3 of those have started to come through to us, which, we'll take a look at where we feel that there is a sufficient bolt-on. That might be in terms of content, for example. It might be a new geography. It might be something that enhances the platform, something that focuses on, a niche area, maybe eating difficulties, for example. So we are certainly looking at things, but watch this space. I would say it's not something that is our core strategy, but we would be opportunistic if we could be.
Yeah. Question about how we plan to address the global opportunity beyond the UK and the US. And so this is part of our long-term strategy, we view that we can't be everywhere. And in fact, it may be better to work alongside and within an existing healthcare provider in some cases. So beyond the UK and US, our game plan there is to license our technology to healthcare operators so they can run Kooth in their country. And a lot of the work we're doing for the US creates the foundation work for that, because often organizations want the data to reside in their country. And so, local privacy laws, for example, always apply. And so what we're doing with the US creates the ability for us to deploy Kooth within a country's clouds in terms of IT infrastructure and operate an independent service outside of the UK. So I think it's another great example of, by tackling the US, it extends our technology platform that will then enable us in the future to license our technology to other providers. Question here about the high inflation, cost of living, and pressure on wages. Is that impacting Kooth? So perhaps, Sanjay, you could cover that one.
Yeah, great. That's a question from John. John, you've also mentioned scaling is the way to boost our profits. The one thing I would say is that whilst we share many characteristics with SaaS businesses, we are never going to be at the 85-90% gross margin of those businesses, because we will always have a human intervention in the work that we do. Counseling cannot be replaced completely by chatbots. So, I expect that our gross margin, currently 65-70%, might tick up a little bit with scale over the coming years, but we will always have that human intervention. And so that does mean that we are impacted by cost of living, pressure on wages. We're currently going through our 2023 round of salary reviews. Historically, we have looked, particularly with the NHS or other healthcare providers, to sign longer term contracts after the initial 12-month pilot period, maybe a 3-year contract. And that was actually all well and good when inflation was running at 1-3%, and we could offer a fixed cost contract, knowing that we'd build operational efficiency into that. That's more difficult now with inflation at around 10%. And so it's something that we're giving quite a lot of thought to. We tend to benchmark ourselves against the NHS, particularly for our service delivery staff. The most recent NHS round of increases was in the region of 4-5%. We wanted to be a little bit ahead of that. And obviously, we're having conversations with our customers about, being able to push some of those increases through to continue to deliver the quality of service that we do. We're having we're getting reasonable traction around that. So, it is a difficult problem. It is something that we're keeping an eye on. We are ensuring that we remain competitive with comparables. But the one area where I suppose we have seen more pressure, certainly at the start of last year, was on the software developers and engineers side. Also sort of slightly impacted by the Great Resignation as those staff started leaving the workplace. But I think in the last few months we've started to see that market loosen up a little bit more as well. But at the start of last year, certainly there were some challenges in bringing software staff in.
Just a few brief questions to answer. How many counsellors do we employ in the UK? What's the current number, Sanjay?
We have in total around 240 practitioners. That's a blend of registered accredited counsellors who typically deliver the sort of structured 8 to 10 sessions, and what we call EWPs, emotional wellbeing practitioners. These are typically ex-teachers or social workers, people who've worked with children, and they are focused more on things like moderation, content, and single session drop-ins.
Great. So, and a follow-up question I'll answer is what qualifications they have. So our individuals that are doing counselling will either have a accreditation or be registered with the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. They will all be degree educated. People that might do more of that early support, emotional wellbeing practitioners have often joined us from a professional background as a teacher or social worker. And every individual in our practitioner team is audited by our clinical team at least once a quarter. We have a huge focus on clinical governance. And of course, unlike other services, the complete audit trail and history of everything that's happened is available in our service. Because it's a text-based messaging service, we have the full transcript for audit purposes of everything that's happened, which is a huge advantage in terms of improving quality of the service over time. A question about the corporate market and the competitive landscape there. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of organizations and a lot of startups focused on selling into corporates with their dream being an app store download that makes them money while they sleep. And so that people can download an app, like a meditation app, and get benefit from that. I think over the last 3 years, and we certainly saw organizations investing in either meditation apps or employee assistance programs when COVID started. I think what we're seeing now is a maturation of people's understanding of what their wants and needs are from these kinds of services. So people's own understanding of them is better now. But the other part of that is our focus is on individuals and employees that have a real need, that might have traumatic jobs, high stress, maybe in low pay occupations. So teachers, we're doing a lot in education right now to support teachers' well-being, ambulance workers, as I mentioned. So I think our focus is to go where there is a real higher need of a service, and meditation apps can't do that. So for us, we're really focused on a niche because I think that probably is the way to tackle a go-to-market in a competitive, broad corporate landscape. Okay, I think we are nearing the end of the questions there. Perhaps one final one for you, Sanjay, which is the end of the half year. You went from reporting a small profit to a loss after tax for H1. Do you see profitability as an important metric for Kooth going forward?
Absolutely, it is. And particularly around EBITDA. I would, however, stress that we are still very much in the growth phase. The business has grown at around 20-30% a year for the last 4 or 5 years. I can't speak directly for investors, but when we IPO'd, the cornerstone investors who came at the time of the IPO are still very much backing the business, and they were backing a growth business. And that's why the management team are in place. So growth is very important to us. But of course, we need the profits to be able to continue to reinvest in the business. I suppose, interestingly, Tim, you'll recall that at the last half year results presentation, investors are now starting to think a bit more about when we will hit cash flow break even, when we will be profitable. This business could, in my view, be profitable within 3 months, but we would have to cut back on investing, particularly in the platform. And I think in the long term, that would be detrimental to the business. But if we had to do that, then we could do so. We have the levers to do so.
Right. Thanks, Sanjay. Well, look, thank you for your great questions. As you think about Kooth, I think probably the key things are to think about the structural demand that there is for mental health. There is in the media every day a growing concern and challenge. We are a service which is trusted, has been here for decades. We didn't pop up on the back of COVID. So I really humbly feel that we are world leading in what we do, given the longevity and experience that we've gained there. And I think as you think about where as an investor you want to spend your time, putting it into an organization that has a huge social purpose and a growth potential, hopefully, is an interesting area for you. So thanks for listening to us, and we'll look forward to updating you next when we issue our annual report in April.
Thank you.
Tim, Sanjay, that's great. And thank you very much indeed for being so generous with your time there and addressing all of those questions that came in from investors this afternoon. And of course, if there are any further questions that do come through, we'll make these available to you immediately after the presentation has ended for you to review, to then add any additional responses, of course, where it's appropriate to do so. Tim, I was just going to ask you for a few closing comments, but I think you just well deliver those, sir. So if it's okay, what I'll do now is redirect those on the call for their feedback, which I know is particularly important to yourself and the company. So Tim, Sanjay, thank you very much once again for updating investors this afternoon. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This may take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of KUF PLC, we would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, so good afternoon to you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.